How are Americans dealing with this whole lockdown thing? Well, not surprisingly, it's not the same for everyone. I'm Dr. Greg Cason, and this is Off the Couch. Now, the COVID-19 pandemic has changed life in America for everybody, even those who aren't on a lockdown order. But it's closed schools, it's closed not grocery stores. I mean, those remain open, but sometimes the lines are incredibly long. But it's just changed all of our daily lives, and we can't see people, we can't go in public, we can't have our friends over, etc. So things are just very different. But interestingly, how it's affected Americans hasn't yet come out yet. It's a little too early. Here in Los Angeles, we've barely gone through 1 month of being locked down, and already the cracks are beginning to show. But we don't know the outward effects, but right now we do have a preliminary study from a group of researchers at the Indiana University at Purdue. And they did an online survey on March 26th. They kind of cut across the United States. They got all different age groups, different genders, different ethnicities, and they basically asked them about their experience during this lockdown and COVID-19 pandemic period. Now, the researchers wanted to find out how people were mentally coping with this pandemic. And actually, the overarching result of the study was actually very encouraging. As of late March, it seemed that most people were coping fairly well. And there were only moderate levels of stress across the study. And it seemed that overall that only about 30% of people thought that they personally were at risk for getting infected with COVID-19. Now, we all see that younger people seem to get a bad rap throughout this. We think that they think they're invincible and nothing will happen to them. We all saw those pictures of people partying in Miami during spring break and just basically flouting the whole COVID-19 pandemic. But those may have been individual outliers. It seems that there really were no differences in the levels of worry across age ranges, and there were no differences in the level of people who thought they might get infected across all age ranges. Now, there were no big surprises in how people were coping with the pandemic. You probably do these things, I do these things. My favorite is here on this graph, I'll show you. The very number one thing is there's a lot of news checking for COVID-19 updates. That's not a surprise. When I covered in my quarantine trauma video, I talked about a study where they found that the people who did the worst during quarantines were people who didn't know what was going on or felt they were being lied to. So it's important actually to try to get information and get accurate information. That's why I applaud the governors who do daily briefings, because actually their daily briefings and being truthful, even sometimes when it's a difficult truth, actually helps calm people. Other things are not as surprising that people did to cope, that talking with friends, watching TV, exercising. Exercising has been a big one, and here on Instagram, when they have all the Instagram live exercises, I just applaud them and I follow along. And believe me, they can be very hard. Other effective coping strategies are things like problem solving, of course, exercising, engaging in hobbies, and a really great one is focusing on things that you feel thankful for. That's really helpful to do, just to look around in your environment. Is it a pet or is it a person? Is it something on the wall? Is it your own health? The very fact that you're able to watch a video like this, it's just good to be thankful. And feeling thankful on a daily basis will actually help you cope better with the stress. The thing I had to laugh about is the very bottom one. The very bottom one is seeking mental health help. You know, right now, it seems, I get a lot of asks about this. The people think that people are just clamoring for therapists to know what's going on. And that may be true with people especially people who had pre-existing mental health conditions. But in general, as long as the general public is given a reason to follow through with these kinds of restrictions, people generally can be okay. Now, not all Americans are doing well during this pandemic. And what was not surprisingly was that a lot of people are suffering because they've lost their jobs, they've lost their income, and they really don't know when their next paycheck is coming in. It appears that according to this survey, a full 35%, that's 1/3 of Americans, had their jobs negatively affected by the COVID-19 pandemic. That's up quite a bit from the number we originally heard, which is 1 in 5 Americans, or 20% of Americans, 1/5. that we thought were affected negatively, and probably that 35% that this study found probably still underestimates it, because what we're about to see is there are going to be some domino effects happening because of this pandemic. What's perhaps very unfortunate is the people with more financial stresses actually end up having more emotional stress and worry, and end up worrying that they're going to get infected with COVID-19 more than someone else. So having those financial stresses seems to depress everything else, and you tend to feel more concerned and more vulnerable about your life. What's perhaps not surprising is that people in urban areas continue to feel more stress and worry than perhaps people do in suburban and rural areas. And that may be not surprising at all, because those were the hardest hit, especially areas like New York and New Jersey in that urban area, or Seattle, or even Los Angeles, where these concerns were a little bit higher because of the denseness of the population. But interestingly, when you look across the board, it's still only about 30% of people are actually worried about becoming infected themselves, no matter where they lived. Now, about 18% of the sample reported being in a higher risk category. Those are the people who might get more sick if they caught COVID-19. 18% is about 1 in 5 people, just approximately. They might have a pre-existing condition, like they might be immunosuppressed, or over 65, or have asthma like me, or another respiratory illness. And so they tend to report a little more worry and a little more concern about becoming infected, of course, than someone else. I think one of the most interesting things about this study is that there was a distinct gender difference. Women tended to report more anxiety, stress, and worry about becoming infected with COVID-19. Thus, they weren't coping quite as well as the men. Now, the researchers suspected, and I think it's pretty intuitive, that the women felt more vulnerability primarily because of their caregiving responsibilities, having to take care of kids, take care of the home, juggle between work and home life, and just generally have more responsibilities and more on their shoulders than perhaps the men do, especially at this time. The encouraging thing, though, is that women are engaging in more coping practices, thus able to weather this storm a little bit. Their biggest coping practices were things like talking to friends, faith-based strategies, and also focusing on what they're thankful for. Now, there were some women who were doing what we call maladaptive coping strategies, and that's coping by using means such as irritability or stress eating, which is one that I often do. And not surprisingly, perhaps, a lot of people, not women, not just men or women, but people across the board, are drinking more. In fact, right when this whole thing happened, grocery stores saw their alcohol sales go through the roof. And that's maybe not surprising, because people see alcohol as a coping strategy and also an effective means to deal with boredom. Now, let's face it, a little bit of drinking is okay, but drinking to cope with all of the stress or to cope with boredom might be over the top. And it seems like the people that had the worst problem with the drinking were people that already had a problem before the pandemic began. Those were the people that we call binge drinkers. So that might be 4 or more drinks for women or 5 or more drinks for men at a sitting. And so when they're put into this position, they tend to increase their alcohol even more, putting them at risk for all kinds of illnesses, if not just death from alcohol poisoning. Now, interestingly enough, the people who drank the most were people in urban or suburban areas, people who were more worried and stressed about the pandemic, not surprisingly, and people who were quarantined with other people. So to paraphrase Jean-Paul Sartre in that play, No Exit, maybe hell really is other people. Now, all is not lost. It seems like of the drinking crew, of that heavy drinking crew, about 30% actually reduced their drinking as a result of the pandemic. And that may be because they don't have access to bars and restaurants, but it also may be because they want to save money, or even that they want to protect their immune system during this pandemic. Now, this wasn't in the study, but it seems like I'm also reading a lot about people's personalities and how they're able to deal with being isolated. And it seems that there's a lot given to people who are introverts, and that they are kind of ready-made for something like this. And that may be the case, especially in the beginning, But the problem with being introverted is that you don't reach out as easily as other people. You see, the thing is, we all need connections. We all need connections with other people, and extroverts are really good at something. They're really good at reaching out to other people, even being obnoxious about it if they need to, sending a text, calling somebody on the phone, doing a Zoom call. All of those things are pretty easy for an extrovert to do, but someone who's introverted who really wants to reach out might have a tougher time. So I think it's not really something we can easily say just because someone's introverted or extroverted that they have an easier or less easy time during this pandemic. Now, as I said in the beginning, there are some cracks beginning to show. We've been on lockdown or stay-at-home order really here in Los Angeles for more than 4 weeks. And already you're seeing more cars on the road, more people in the streets walking around. You're generally seeing a little more buzz, a little more action. And I even hear about people going over to other people's houses and sometimes just flouting the idea of this lockdown or stay-at-home order. Now, in the beginning, we all had a purpose. We all had a purpose because maybe the purpose was we had fear. We didn't want to get infected with this virus. We had a purpose because we didn't want to infect other people with the virus. And we also had a purpose to society that we wanted to flatten the curve so that we could keep our hospitals from becoming overwhelmed. But as time goes on, people's fear starts to reduce and they start to acclimate. And then they start to think, yeah, maybe I don't need to do this. I'm going to go out. And if one person goes out or 2 people go out, then someone else is looking out their window and thinks, hey, why does that person get to do it and I don't? And then they want to go outside. So the one thing is, it's kind of interesting over time is that we're going to start to see people pushing on the limits and start to push the rules, which may actually cause this pandemic to be elongated even more. Now in America, we're a little bit looser of a society. We do our own thing. We have that rugged individualism thing going on for us. So we're often rule pushers or rule violators. But maybe this time we need a purpose. We really do need that purpose, and we need it from the top. We need it from our governors. We need it from our federal government, if they can do it, is to help us know that we're all in this together and we all have a purpose and that we're all in the same fight together. That's the one thing that could actually help people right now, is to have that clear and concise message that we're doing this for a bigger cause. We're doing it for other people. We're doing it for our fellow American. That's something that could actually help people to stay inside through this rough time. Until then, we'll have to use all of our coping strategies. I'm about to head over to the refrigerator right now. But until then, I'm Dr. Greg Cason, and this is Off the Couch.